The following program is a UW-TV classic.
As many as a third of all married women in this country experience violence. Why do men batter women? Ahead on Upon Reflection.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
I'm Ross Reynolds. Welcome to Upon Reflection. For most of U.S. history, it's been legal for husbands to beat their wives. The law has changed. The behavior has not. It's been estimated that as many as a third of all married women will experience at least one episode of violence in their married lives. Why do men do it? What can get them to stop? The new book, When Men Batter Women, New Insights into Ending Abusive Relationships, explores those questions. It's co-written by Dr. Neil Jacobson, Dr. John Gottman. You may remember John Gottman as our guest earlier this season, talking about couples and relationships. Today, Neil Jacobson joins us to discuss what happens when those relationships go very wrong. Neil Jacobson is a professor of psychology at the University of Washington. Thanks very much for being with us, Neil.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
So one might wonder, first of all, why study this the issue of men beating women as a psychological issue. Some may say this is criminal behavior. These men could be controlling themselves. It's not. What's there to know?
Well, I think that it's a psychological issue because it involves the behavior of individual batterers as well as something that can be looked upon at a broader societal level. And before we started doing our research, we didn't know how much of it could be explained by psychological causes. I think now we know that it probably should be looked at primarily as an issue for the criminal justice system, but research like ours hadn't been done at the time we started our research.
And you found out that actually, although this problem is pervasive anecdotally and also in the figures that I quoted earlier in this program, it hadn't really been studied that much.
Yeah, there had been some research by sociologists which gave us a lot of valuable information about prevalence and about how widespread the problem was, and some very interesting clinical observations from people in the trenches working with battered women or with batterers. But the kind of systematic, controlled, scientific investigations that John and I were both used to conducting with couples hadn't really been done with batterers and battered women.
Your method is very interesting. Could you take a moment to explain how it was that you identified couples that were in relationships like this, and then how it was that you studied them?
Well, we cast a very broad net. We sent public service announcements all through the Seattle area, simply asking for couples in conflict. And hundreds of couples responded to that public service announcement, and we simply picked the ones who met our criteria for battering. And we studied those, and then we also found a group of unhappy couples, but where there was no violence, so that we could have a control group. And we had a happily married group as well as a couple exhibiting a very low level of violence, not the kind of violence that typically gets you into trouble with the police and the prosecutors and the criminal justice system. So we actually had 4 groups in all, but we got them that way.
And how did you observe them once you'd identified people?
What we did that hadn't been done before is we took a population of very severe batterers and we videotaped them during arguments with their wives. And we had to take a number of precautions to ensure that we didn't induce violence when we subjected them to these procedures, but we developed some very careful debriefing procedures, and we watched them and then coded their behavior systematically so that we could, for the first time, actually observe severe arguments among a population of batterers and battered women. We also hooked them up to polygraphs so we could get measures of physiological responses in order to really find out what was going on with them emotionally. Heart rate doesn't lie, but batterers often do. And we also followed them over time because we thought it was important to find out what happens to these relationships over time. When do women get out of abusive relationships? When does the violence stop? Since we started our research, other people have begun to do longitudinal studies of their own, and they've started to get published, but at the time we started, there weren't any. So no one really knew. We were there to watch the women when they left. We were there to interview them after they left. And we learned a tremendous amount and put it all into the book about the trajectories of these relationships over time. And so I would say that there were at least those 4 characteristics that were unique about it.
How long a period of time were you able to study these couples?
Well, we started in 1990, and we're still studying them. We did a 2-year follow-up in 1992 and 93. We did a 5-year follow-up in 1995. At that point, we wrote the book, and we continue to stay in touch with them, and we will stay in touch with them as long as we can find them.
Tell me how you defined aggressive battering or violence for the purposes of this study. What do you exactly mean by that?
Well, for the purposes of the book, so that people would understand the difference between battering and physical aggression, we defined battering as physical aggression which functioned as a method of controlling, subjugating, or intimidating another human being. It always, or virtually always, involves fear on the part of the victim, and it almost always results in injury. And it's something that men do to women, but women do not do to men.
Battery, by definition, is something that men do to women?
Certainly in the 25 years that I've been studying couples, I have yet to see a single instance of a woman battering a man according to that definition of battering.
And yet you did say that violent altercations or physical altercations between men and women happen almost on an equal number of cases within relationships, did you not?
Well, women fight back, usually in self-defense, sometimes as a futile act of frustration, and occasionally just because they're angry. But if you look at the entire context of the relationship, what you invariably find is that the man is the batterer, the female the battered woman. Can I give you an example?
Sure.
There was one couple where the husband walked in the door and the wife threw a brick at him and knocked him unconscious, and he had a concussion. Now, if you look at that incident in isolation, you would say that she was a batterer and he was a battered man. Poor guy. But if you look at their entire relationship, what you find out is that the night before, he choked her and tried to kill her. During the course of the next day, she got very angry about the fact that he had tried to kill her, and she plotted her revenge. But who's the batterer?
Well, you also point out that just the physical size of men means that in any kind of altercation, the damage is usually done to the women.
Right. In order to be a batterer, you have to be able to be physically strong enough to instill fear in your partner. Weapons will do that to some extent, but it's the physical strength. It's also the socialization. Men are brought up in our culture to believe that it's okay to beat up women under certain circumstances. Women are not brought up to believe that it's okay to beat up men under certain circumstances.
Under what circumstances does society tell us it's okay for men to beat up women?
Well, it depends on where and when you're talking about. But throughout the history of civilization, men had absolute authority over everyone in the family, including their wives. And up until the 70s, it was legal in Texas and in New Mexico to shoot your wife and kill her if you found her in bed with another man. The wife did not enjoy the same privilege. And he wasn't allowed to kill the other guy, just his wife. So for most of our history, certain challenges to the absolute authority of men have been considered to be justifications for wife beating. Now, you mentioned that the laws have changed, But that doesn't mean that people's values have changed. Mm-hmm. And one of the problems in providing safety for battered women is that we still have police, judges, prosecutors, members of the public with values that men should be the heads of the household, that they should have absolute authority over the women that they're with, and they look the other way at a little bit of violence now and then. And even some battered women feel that way. So you have a very hard time changing values that have been around since the beginning of civilization.
So you've mentioned one of the reasons that men batter women, they feel entitled to. They've been taught that it's okay to do that. Is it also an issue of men wanting to exercise control over women and using violence as a means to that end?
Absolutely. It's many men in our culture grow up believing that they have a right to control the women that they're married to or the women that they're dating, and that the ends justify the means. That is, if they have to use violence because that's the only way they can maintain control, then violence is justified. If they can exercise that control in other ways, they will. But the values, there's an honor code that says that being in control of your women is something you want to be able to tell your buddies that you're able to do. We had some cases in our sample, for example, where men would go to work and tell their stories, and they would get razzed by their fellow workers for letting their wives control them like that. Mm. And they'd go home and beat them up the next night because there's this honor code that exists in many strata of our society, that you don't take that kind of stuff from women.
One of the newer things that you turned up in this research is discovering that there is not a single kind of male batterer. In fact, that we might assume that in a situation where a man was beating a woman, he would be very excited or very energized, or his heartbeat would go up. But you found in some cases, I guess about 1 in 5, quite the opposite was the case.
That's right. We found out that, and it was a chilling discovery. It occurred at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night. As we were looking at our data, we almost couldn't believe it when we first found it, but that there are about 20% of the batterers in our sample were actually calmed. They actually calmed down internally as they became more aggressive behaviorally. So if you were to look at them, you'd think they're about to have a stroke or a heart attack, but internally we're talking about heart rates that were as low as 35 beats per minute. And we likened them to cobras because the cobra, before the cobra strikes, is very still, very calm, and then strikes with tremendous ferocity and tremendous force and very quickly. But they're very calm, and I think what we're talking about is the way some men, the cobras, maximize the impact of their aggression is by calming down and focusing their attention on maximizing that impact.
By being very rational and calm about it, they can inflict the maximum damage and
that's
cause
right.
the maximum
That's right.
terror.
That's right. They want to be very focused. It's about focused attention. There's actually some literature in psychology to suggest that when under times of stress, when your heart rate goes down, that has to do with focused attention. So the more focused you are, the more likely it is that your aggression will have the impact that it's supposed to have.
That's such an extraordinary finding, because conventional wisdom would have it that if you're about to lose your temper and commit violence against someone, the first thing you want to do is begin to calm down, and yet you found that these people were calm to start with.
Actually, no, they calmed down after we had them rest, and then they started to argue, and as they argued, they got calmer and calmer, which was even more amazing. Mm-hmm. It's not just that they were calm to begin with, they got calmer as they got more aggressive.
Do you know why?
And they were the ones, these cobras were the ones who were the most severely violent, the ones who used knives and guns, the most belligerent and contemptuous and emotionally abusive, the ones with the long rap sheets, the ones who are also violent to other people, the ones who are addicted to illegal drugs as well as alcohol. And interestingly, their relationships were remarkably stable.
No kidding.
Whereas, battered women tend to get out of abusive relationships very quickly. With the Cobras and their spouses, at our 2-year follow-up, there were no divorces.
Why was that?
At all. We think it had mostly to do with them simply being so scary to the women that the women were afraid to leave. There's also a certain element that can't be denied of attachment between batters and battered women that has to be considered when you're trying to work with a battered woman to help her find a safe escape route. But I think that most of it is fear.
What's the nature of that attachment that comes into play in some way between the batterer and the person?
Well, the attachment is that the Cobras, most of whom are psychopaths, are extremely good at figuring out how to exploit whatever vulnerability the woman they're with might have. And so they use that vulnerability to get the woman to fall in love with them. And then they use that ability to get the woman economically dependent. And they are such expert con men that they con not just the women that they're with, but they con the police when the police come to the scene of the crime, and very often the woman gets arrested even though she's the one who's just gotten beaten up. They con prosecutors into believing that they shouldn't be prosecuted, that they really are reformed. They've learned how to talk the talk in therapy, and therefore they often are the ones who are labeled as cured. Meanwhile, they go back and they start beating up their wives again. And they are extremely clever at coming across as people who have shaped up, when in fact, like most psychopaths, they're hedonistic, they're concerned only about getting what they want when they want it, whereas most batterers, the other 80%, have a lot in common with the rest of us, really.
Let's talk about that other 80%. Do you classify them as the Pitbulls?
We use the Pitbull metaphor, and that has gotten me in trouble with some of my friends who have Pitbulls as pets and insist that they're gentle animals. And maybe they are, but we use the Pitbull metaphor because once the Pitbull sinks his or her teeth into you, the Pitbull doesn't let go. And the thing about the Pitbulls that was most striking was their emotional dependency and their jealousy and their extreme attachment to their battered woman partners. So in some ways they were more dangerous in the long run because the Cobra will go on to something else if they can't get you right away. Whereas the Pitbull will stalk, even if it takes years, and will engage in an obsessive effort to get the wife back, or the girlfriend, or the ex-wife. And sometimes it goes on for years. So the pit bulls tend to be the stalkers, the ones who get pathologically jealous. One of our red flags that we mention in the book is be very, very careful of men who show jealousy early in a relationship. That is a very bad sign. That's a sign that you're getting involved with a pit bull.
What are some of the other signs that you got out of studying both types of men who do battering, Cobras and pit bulls, that women should pay attention to?
Well, the alcohol and drug abuse are the combination was very, very prevalent in our sample. In fact, the combination of alcohol and either heroin or cocaine abuse was almost always present among the Cobras. The pit bulls abused alcohol, but very rarely heroin or cocaine. But that's definitely, any kind of drug addiction is a red flag because it's highly correlated with violence. anyone who's been in an abusive relationship, anyone who's been a batterer in a previous relationship, or who tells you that the previous relationship got violent, there's a tendency for them to explain it in a way which makes them sound like victims. And if they're pit bulls, they really feel like they are victims. But if they're cobras, they're just feeding you a line. In fact, they probably wouldn't tell you in the first place. But the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. Chances are, if there was violence in a previous relationship, you're getting involved with a batterer, and get out as quickly as you can.
Is there any possibility of a man and a woman in a relationship where the man has been a batterer, of that relationship getting fixed, getting repaired?
Yes, it's possible, but it's very unlikely to happen through couple therapy. In our sample, for example, couple therapy was associated with the violence getting worse and with the woman staying in the relationship.
Let's back up for a second. Couples that went into couple therapy to try to deal with physical abuse issues, the physical abuse got worse than it was before?
It got worse, and the woman was more likely to stay in the relationship. So couple therapy, as practiced in the Seattle community, and we have no reason to assume that Seattle is any different from anywhere else, couple therapy as practiced in the Seattle community is associated with women staying in abusive relationships and the violence getting worse, probably the worst possible outcome.
Now, why would that be? You might assume that couples therapy wouldn't help them get better, but why would it actually make the situation worse?
Well, because one thing it does is it forces you to deal with conflict on a regular, almost weekly basis. And couples avoid each other. They have a way of regulating violence through avoiding conflict, not leading parallel lives. Couple therapy makes that almost impossible. The other thing, which I think is even more dangerous about couple therapy, is when you treat them as a couple, you're saying in effect that the violence is a mutual problem. Whereas virtually everyone I know who works with batterers or battered women agrees that if the violence is going to have even a slight chance of stopping, the first thing that has to happen is both the battered woman and, more importantly, the batterer have to acknowledge that it is his responsibility and his alone. If he argues that under certain circumstances his violence was justified, then he's a bad candidate for stopping.
What about therapy that doesn't deal with the two as a couple, but singles out the man and tries to work with him? Do you have any indicators on whether that is at all successful?
Well, the research has not been particularly good or definitive, but there is at least one major study that hasn't been published yet, which would make any objective reader very pessimistic about any form of therapy with batterers. We try to be cautious about this in the book, but after finding out the results of this one study, I'm going to be less cautious about it here and in other media appearances that I make. I think that we should think of batterers as criminals. I think battery should be an automatic felony if it's committed against a spouse. I think there should be a mandatory jail sentence. I think it should be a maximum rather than a minimum sentence. And if they want to enter into psychotherapy or education or rehabilitation through psychological methods while they're in prison, I wouldn't stop them. And I wouldn't give up on therapy. I would continue to encourage people to try and develop treatments. I'm just not particularly optimistic that psychotherapy, not all jobs are best solved by psychotherapy, and this may be one of them.
Well, some men who commit sexual abuse are put in terms of civil commitment, where even when they finish their jail terms, they are kept under lock and key and under observation until they can demonstrate that they're psychologically well enough to re-enter the community. Do you think that's the kind of approach that should be taken with men who batter women?
Well, I've actually, it's a very interesting question. I've never actually thought about the mechanics of how one would do that. But if there was a way for every woman who meets this batterer to know that he is a batterer, or at least was a batterer, and the jury's out on whether he will continue to be a batterer, I'd be in favor of it. Mm-hmm. I think it's analogous to what happens to pedophiles when they get released from prison. Women have a right to know.
What about some of the other law enforcement and legal practices that are in place for dealing with battered women? Specifically, many police departments now are removing the husband from the household immediately when an incident is reported. Do you think that's a good approach?
Well, it's a good approach if it's followed up by prosecution and punishment. The problem is arrest by itself will deter an upper middle class or professional batterer, but it's not going to deter a working class or poor batterer. There's very solid evidence of that.
What will? Do we know?
Well, the only thing that we can be sure of is that while they're in jail, they're not dangerous to anybody but the prison guards. And the women have time to develop some sort of safety plan. So I say lock them up.
What questions are still left in your mind from having finished this research in this book? What are the big unanswered questions about men battering women?
The biggest and most significant unanswered question to me is how can we use the resourcefulness, the heroism, and the courage of battered women to improve the services that we provide for them? Agencies in the community, in the Seattle community and in other communities that exist for battered women are pathetically underfunded and often have to stop at the point at which the women are safe. But just because you're safe doesn't mean your troubles are over. Imagine what it would be like to have been with someone who's been beating you for 10, 15 years. Your worldview is shattered. Your trust in humankind is gone. You're often indigent and you have children to worry about. And you're certainly not going to get child support from the battering husband because he doesn't care about the kids, typically. So there's a lot to be done. Battered women often worry about they often blame themselves for the fact that they were in an abusive relationship, even though they shouldn't, even though it could happen to anybody. And therefore they doubt their judgment in terms of getting into new relationships. And so it would be nice if the services were available to help them through the process of adjustment to getting out of that kind of relationship.
The book is called When Men Batter Women. Dr. Neil Jacobson is the co-author. Thanks very much for being with us on
It was
Upon
my
Reflection.
pleasure. To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.